Fantastic evening that we're about to have. Are we on to the internet? I'm going to make Mel climb under a table. My name is Adam. I'm a volunteer here with OWASP Ottawa. If you're another volunteer with OWASP Ottawa, raise your hand. These are some of the great folks that help make this happen every month, except next month. We'll talk about that. But this is a great community. I'm really grateful to be a part of it. And we're always looking for others who would like to help join and have things continue. We've had a couple of great events this year in addition to our monthly meetups, and we only do that through the power of volunteers and the support of Mother OWASP, which I'll also talk about here in a moment. But if you would like to get involved, or if you're looking to find out what we're doing in the new year, you can find us on the internet. The easiest place to go is owasp.org/Ottawa. You'll find all of the things that you need to find about us there, including our Slack channel, which is kind of the easiest way to keep in regular contact with us. But of course, there are other options as well. Check it out. Speaking of OWASP, if you have a membership, you might have voted in the recent board elections. Those results are posted. Go take a look, see if maybe you won. I'm not sure that anybody here was running, but OWASP, of course, is the overarching organization that our chapter belongs to. A membership does support the organization. You get an email address and a bunch of other opportunities, so feel free to check that out as well. On our page at owasp.org/Ottawa, you will also find our call for speakers. We are always looking for speakers of all levels of experience. It's an easy room to start in if this is one of your first talks. We also have had some fantastic experienced speakers as well. So we do run the gamut, and we would love to hear what you would like to share with the community. So again, owasp.org/Ottawa. You can find a link to the submission form for continuous intake for talks, and we'd love to have a review of that and see when we can fit you in the new year. There will not be a monthly meetup next month. It's a busy month. People are doing other things, and maybe we'll have more snow. Who knows? So we will not be meeting next month, but we do look forward to meeting you again in the new year. We will, in lieu of meeting, have a survey coming out in the next few weeks, as we do every year. We would love to get your feedback on what has gone well, where we've got opportunities to improve, and we do read every single response to that. So, without further ado, does anybody else have anything else I was supposed to say? No. Okay. One actual thing that I am supposed to say, you might be joining us on the internet. And that's because we've got a camera in this room. So you guys should be aware we do stream this every month to the internet. We record the front of the room, but there's also a camera that shoots from the back, I believe. If you're in this room, this part of the room, you might be in it. If you don't want to be, you can move your way back to one of the open seats in the back. Pizza here, courtesy of the team at Rewind. Greg, are you here this week? We don't have Greg, but we do have Greg's Pizza. Can we give Greg a round of applause? Thank you to the team at Rewind. Okay. I'm going to pull up my notes. Has anybody ever been caught by an assumption? A couple people laughed. I think that's probably something that trips us up more often than we might like to admit. Renee Walendi is here to talk to us this week about some of the assumptions we might have about our security models that rely on hardware. Renee likes to call himself a computer scientist, although I think he probably likes to, or spends a lot of his time working with people. And at the end of the day, Renee is going to tell us all about why we might want to have a second thought about some of the assumptions that we have when we're doing our threat modeling related to systems that sit on hardware. Without further ado, I'm going to give you your mic and we'll get going.
All right. Hi, everyone in this room. Hello to the online audience. And thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, so thank you for... can we check the video feed? So I think my output is frozen.
There is nothing I'm going to be able to do from here at this point.
All right. Let me try to restart the screen share.
I'll clear it.
Ooh, okay.
Shall I be the clicker?
The issue is that the video stream from here to the StreamYard doesn't work.
It seems to be staying with them.
Is it going? But it's still going back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It would just pause for a good 15 seconds.
Once again, not
Do you,
touching it, right?
Who's got their stuff wrapped?
is it possible to run your slideshow off like another computer?
We can totally do that, yeah.
We can share it here.
It is buffering something, and then it like keeps slipping back and forth.
What format is your slideshow?
It's PowerPoint.
Okay. Could you email that to Garth?
Yep.
This is where I.
Sorry about that.
It's a silicon problem.
Wait, I have one last idea, because this is a virtual machine. If I screen share it from inside the virtual machine, then it's on Windows. So the weird Linux issue might not be a problem anymore. Let's try that for one last thing, and then... Okay.
It sounds like Inception.
Yes.
It's an assumption about Inception.
It is an assumption I'm willing to try before giving up my speaker notes. So let's start our beloved Edge and see if we can make that work.
This never happens in a live streaming presentation.
Yeah, they must have any issues out there.
Okay, I see a window. Can I try to put that on stage?
Let's see it.
Okay. That looks good. Okay, so thank you for joining our live debugging session today. That is Linux versus Windows, and apparently Edge wins today. Yeah, so thanks all for joining the talk here and online. I want to talk about hardware and where it sits in your threat model and where it maybe should sit in your threat model. So obligatory, who's that guy slide. I am a PhD student at Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy in Bochum, Germany. I do interdisciplinary research. So I consider myself somewhat of a computer scientist, but really most of the time I spent working with humans using computers, not computers directly. To give you some context about what we do in Bochum, we are one of the old mining areas in Germany, like an hour north of Cologne. And nowadays, Bochum hosts two of the largest cybersecurity research institutions, namely Ruhr University and the Max Planck Institute, which I'm a member of. And we have about 300 researchers and about 1,000 cybersecurity students, bachelors and masters, and also about 30 startups. And our transfer lab is always looking for cooperations between academia and industry. So we're always happy to find ways how we can build bridges, how we can work together. And that talk is somewhat part of that. To start off with some interactivity, I would like to do a brief audience poll. So just by a show of hands, so I kind of get a feel for who's in the room today. Whose job here in this room is it to write software? All right, that's like a third. Let's keep going. Whose job is it to write secure software specifically? Oh, that is a lot less people. Okay, that is different people. That is people that didn't. That is interesting. Okay, who of those people are considering hardware security as part of what they do? I see 1, 2, and a careful third hand. All right. And who here trusts the hardware vendor of the servers or systems that you operate? Who here thinks they should be trusting the hardware vendor of the servers they operate? Okay. So the question of this talk essentially is, well, should you? And to give us some context, give you some idea of where we are thematically. So I'm not going to talk about software security, authentication, memory safety, control flow stuff. Below that, we have microarchitecture. This is where Spectre and Meltdown and all of these weird CPU vulnerabilities live. They have shown us that microarchitectural state matters, and then you can do weird things with side channels and isolation between processes or not. That's also not what I'm going to be talking about today. There's a layer below that, and that is the layer of individual transistors. That is what my working group, my lab, is concerned with. It forms the root of trust for most of the applications that run on top of this stack. And that makes it a lot more opaque. It's a lot more difficult to look into this as a software dev, even as a firmware dev. And that makes it potentially a lot more dangerous. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So when we talk hardware security, there's 3 major threat models that are usually considered, at least in academic research. The first one being extraction of cryptographic secrets. So attacking the unmodified benign hardware at rest to get some secrets out of it. Intellectual property infringement and counterfeiting. So making kind of illegal hardware in some sense. And then the third threat model is hardware Trojans. So that means making modified and potentially malicious hardware. Model we're considering here is that hardware is going to be designed by someone. It is also going to be produced by potentially someone else as part of a contract. What if whoever produces that hardware has a malicious intent and messes with the design, so what you get is not what you ordered? That has direct and uniquely dangerous implications for the software that runs on top of the stack, and that's what I'd like to focus on today. So why am I so scared about those hardware Trojans, and why do I think this is a realistic threat model? Well, it turns out that the hardware supply chain is an incredibly convoluted and opaque thing. So just have a look at a few of the players in this space. So there are some companies, often based in the United States, that design chips, but they're not actually manufacturing them. They're outsourcing that to companies all over the world. A lot of them are placed in Asia. Some of them are placed in Europe. And lastly, there's also some companies that make the equipment that those companies make the chips with, like ASML. So that means that our hardware and the intellectual property of the designs can travel around the world multiple times during that entire process of going from design to having the physical CPU you plug into your system. And at any point in that supply chain, there's a risk of having a malicious actor or having your design or your physical device intercepted and modified. And we have historical precedent that people are doing this kind of stuff. Mostly state-level actors, but on the design side, there is more that can be done. So that raises the question of provenance, of attribution. This has been discussed recently in software supply chains a lot. The software supply chain issues have recently made it into the OWASP top 10, and think, pretty high up, like 3rd place or something, right? But I would like to argue that the same goes for the hardware that you intend to trust when you build your stack. When that supply chain messes up, you get foofed. Does anyone in this room, sorry if I make you date yourself, remember this chip? Yeah. What was wrong with it? The floating point math, that was one of it. So it has a hardware bug inside. There was something else that was wrong with it. Like, Intel, please don't sue me. There was something else that was wrong with it. It had the foof bug. Yes, the same chip had 2 different issues that both could be exploited somewhat. There's a trend behind that. So what the foof bug is this instruction. It's with log, compare, and exchange 8 bytes from register EAX. Doesn't have to tell you anything. That instruction doesn't make any sense. The CPU will still happily execute it, stumble over itself, halt and catch fire in a figurative sense. So what this is, it's a hardware denial of service. Run this execution, the CPU will lock up. It runs into a deadlock because the designers didn't account for someone trying that. It's not in the manual, but it runs once. And this can be in a normal user space program. This is not kernel level code. This has no privilege. So you can run this from user space. If you execute user provided code as the operating system, the CPU will lock, interrupts are disabled. There's no way for you to get control back. And the only thing you can do is you can power cycle the system. Hardware reset buttons come in very handy. Do this in a server setting somewhere in a rack. Hope your IPMI still works. Yeah, and you already brought this up. This thing had the other bug, the fdiff bug, so it miscalculated its math. That was also not great. That being one example, we have seen this again and again and again. So Intel has done this in 1994 is when they found about that. They did it again in 97. I'm skipping a bunch of years. AMD did it in 2014. They did it again in 2019, and Intel did it recently again. So this happens every few years with major CPU manufacturers. No one is immune against this. And really, can we blame them for microarchitectural machines that are as complicated as they are? Probably we can't. But what this tells us is that such hardware issues can happen. They can be exploitable. And they can totally pass through validation testing of one of the most experienced manufacturers out there. So what does this tell us about what happens if someone tries to do this, not by accident, but with intent? That is what we mean by hardware Trojans. It's a field of research that's been going on in the academic space since about 2017. About like 2007. 2007. It's been started with the Department of Defense commissioning a report on the US semiconductor supply chain, mostly for military use. And they got sketched out a bit because most of the chips were being made by companies that might not be politically friendly to them. That kicked off a whole bunch of research. And ever since then, publication volume year over year has been steadily increasing. In 2024, we published roughly 1,200 papers that concern hardware Trojans in some way. And if we look at what happened along the way, Snowden being one of those, then the big hack, who remembers that thing, the Bloomberg story? So they allegedly found a manipulated chip in hardware that was allegedly used by some of the big players. And now no one wants to know, no one says they never knew anything about that, which is a bit strange. Huawei happened, so people were concerned that foreign manufacturers are going to do weird stuff with your hardware or with the firm that runs on top of it. Nothing really ever came out of that, but it's spurred a big discussion. So, okay, enough with the context. Let's get specific here. I've been told IT folks and ITS, IT security folks, like threat modeling. So let's dive in a concrete example of what an attacker might want to do on your hardware to mess with your software side. So let's assume we're writing this little Python snippet that's essentially just going to give us a secure random number. Can someone from you give me like a one-liner what actually happens when you ask your computer for a random number? You studied this stuff. What does it do? Well, I'm going to sum it up with the operating system does some magic. So we ask the operating system do that, and then it comes back to us with some number. Assuming we don't do this in software, which we could do if we just want to write a computer game, but if we want secure random number, we need a lot more computation. Modern systems do this in a way where at some point they are going to hit the hardware. So modern CPUs have a physical true random number generator on them. And the way that works is they sample kind of thermal noise in the silicon to produce actually true unpredictable random numbers in an instruction that is called RD-RAND or RD-seed. That's just an assembler instruction. And that produces a hopefully unpredictable value. The operating system takes that, does its magic on it again, and then returns it to the program, and you get some number out. So why might that be a problem? Well, if we manage to Trojanize this instruction to make it do something that we don't want to do, then we can mess with the way that cryptography works in software. Because most of security proofs out there start with let k be a fresh and uniformly random distributed key, then the following holds. So now your system is provably secure on the software side, but it still owns you because you trust that this random number is random, and it might not be. If that happens, then the consequences can be you can break TLS, you can break disk encryption at rest, and without any kind of software compromise. That also means without any kinds of logs about that. So you don't have any indicators, you just have a bad random number generated. That might be a problem. So what does it take to actually do that? If you look at a current Intel CPU, so current Arrow Lake, I think, has about 18 billion transistors on it. So the chip itself is about, 26 millimeters in width. And the thing that is, my animation got stuck, sorry. So the thing that does the actual computation is this part of it. So that's like a fake color die shot. That's the compute logic, and the single compute core is actually only this tiny. That is the entire complex machine that actually runs your operating system. Well, and this stuff is kind of all of the rest that makes your system work that you don't really ever directly interact with from software. And in there, there's your random number generator somewhere. Intel doesn't publish where exactly it is. It currently publishes a surprising amount of data about it, but it's not going to tell you where it is. It's about, well, there is a tiny pixel. I think it's smaller than the projector can show. It is incredibly tiny. So that means if we can modify like a single % of that random number generator to just break it enough that it's insecure, you're having a single broken % in that tiny little pixel of size, and now you're trying to fish for that on the chip. Verifying that is really, really hard. I'm bashing on Intel here. I just took this Intel CPU. This goes for any kind of microprocessor that has a random source on it. This is like not Intel specific. AMD has the same issue. ARM can have the same issue if it runs on hardware that supports that. Yeah, so overall, what's our idea? We manipulate that random number generator. We try not to get caught because it's so tiny. Well, then hopefully we make a bunch of profit. As researchers, we face two challenges when we look at this kind of stuff, which is that we don't really hear about hardware Trojan exploits in the wild. And whenever something does surface, like in that big hack of Bloomberg, people spend a lot of time discrediting all of the sources that are out there. And at some point, no one wants to have ever said anything. And most research in this space therefore focuses on detection of Trojans, which is super important. But if we want to astound the attacker, maybe we need to build one. So our lab got to work a couple of years ago, and at least on a theoretical sense, we came up with an idea. What can you actually do? What's kind of the minimal change you can make to make this thing woefully insecure, but more or less undetectable? So here's an idea for how that might work. So this is essentially a cross-section of how a planar transistor looks like. I don't want to turn you all into chip designers, so I'm going to keep this brief. But the important part is, well, you have a connection here, you have a connection on the other side, and that gate is kind of your power-controlled switch. So if you put power into this, this becomes conductive, and vice versa. This is how you build all logic gates, all Boolean logic gates that exist on your hardware. So if we can make a clone out of this thing, and we can get it to change this dopant region to kind of flip it around. So we need to modify this on the design before the factory makes this chip. Then we can make this weird transistor that is not actually a transistor. From that, what we can build is we could try to build this kind of inverter. Don't get too hung up about all of the symbols. The important thing here is this thing has an input and an output. And so this is not A. This is how you build an inverter in hardware. If we modify this, it turns into that thing. You don't need to understand the whole technicalities. The important part is this doesn't look right. So that one transistor is always closed, that other is always open, and that means that the output is always 1, regardless of the input. So now we have a stuck bit. Can we find this? One is the manipulated one is the original one. Can we get a show of hands if it's the left? Give me a hand if it's the left one that has the Trojan. Give me a hand if it's the right one that has the Trojan. Okay, I messed with you. It's the same picture. So the point is that this kind of dopant hacking, so changing P and N doping, is incredibly difficult to detect using microscopy inspection. Yes, it can be done. I know. There are chemical methods you can use to find this, but it's crazy expensive and labor-intensive to do it. So that makes verification even harder. So that might be one way we could pull this off. So now we have this stuck transistor. What do we do with it? Well, we are going to mess up our random number generator. The idea being there's this kind of entropy source, the true random number generator, that noise sampling thing somewhere in our CPU. And it spits out ones and zeros, hopefully at about 50% each all the time. CPU does a bunch of post-processing and then spits it out to the operating system. From that, we derive our cryptographic key. And then that's 128-bit of true randomness. So that means there's 2 to the 128 actual possible keys. We're trying to mess with this so that the post-processing breaks in a way that hopefully our self-test doesn't catch. To reduce this to 2 to the 32 keys. We don't want to make it a single key because that's obvious. We want to still make it pass randomness checks. So if you look at it, because you're not going to sample 2 to the 32 keys to try this. You're going to sample a few and say, yeah, that looks about right. You're going to ship it. But that space is so much smaller that now we can have a brute force attack. How are we doing this? Well, this is roughly how that works. So the post-processing looks like this. So you load all of these numbers into some registers. And then you have an AES block. That's not the AES NI, if that tells someone something. It's a special AES core that runs alongside the CPU. Software can't touch it. And it chugs along doing its own thing. And overall, we have 256 random bits, 2 times 128. Now, what we are trying to do is we are trying to fix that input, and we're trying to fix part of that register. There's other configurations you can do, but the end effect is going to be that we only have 32 bits of actual randomness in there, which then means that our crypto key still looks random. But now, essentially, we just have 1 billion keys, and on a modern CPU, you can just brute force them in a couple seconds, at which point you have a key that is randomly looking, but actually not random enough. Summing up, such vulnerabilities are dangerous for 2 reasons. They live on a layer where it's very, very hard to observe them, and they can mess with your software in ways that are super weird and extremely subtle, and they can break stuff in very fundamental ways. And we really don't want them because patch day is a hassle enough if it comes through Windows Update, and we don't want our Tuesdays to look like this in the future, where we actually have to replace CPU parts, and no one actually does that anyway. Side note, while I researched this talk, I learned that just 2 weeks ago, AMD broke that exact RD rand instruction on their current Ryzen. Again, the third time. Now what it does, it produces one single number all the time. So if your operating system is smart, it will detect that. But it produces that one single number, and then if you run the health check on it, it will happily report that the random number source is totally in order. So you're supposed to check this in software, check the health check, because it gives you one check bit, and then it gives you a random number. And the check bit is always clear. So you believe that the number is right, your software believes the number is right, but it's always FFFFF. There's a microcode update in the works for that, so that can be patched in software, luckily. But just goes to say, like, this happens over and over again. It's a real threat, even if it happens by mistake and not by someone actually putting this in for nefarious reasons. So takeaways from this. Security guarantees often assume that our hardware is honest. Cryptographic proofs depend on this. If you have a random number generator on the CPU that is modified, that proof falls apart. Hardware Trojans can undermine that integrity of that hardware. This is really hard to find, and it's essentially unpatchable, except if you exchange the chips, which no one will do. And that means this is dangerous because that attack vector, if we look at cryptographic proofs, lives outside of our threat model. And that means this is the way how our provably secure encrypted stuff gets owned in the end. So that all sounds a bit dire. I have some ideas for what we can do today on the software side, on the procurement side, on the admin side, to the end of the talk. But there's also some really cool research that's going on into providing evidence for Trojans in hardware. And here's one project that I want to show off. That's work from a couple colleagues on my team. So more than 20 years ago, looking for these things was a lot easier, not easy, but easier than it is today, because chips were much simpler. So what you do is you would essentially take those chips, put it under a very high magnification microscope, take a snapshot, print it out, tape it all together, put it down on the floor, and then you would crawl around with a bunch of really smart engineers and trying to look for, is there anything on that circuit that's not supposed to be there? That's how you'd find your Trojans. My lab likes to call this the crawl around on the floor Trojan detection algorithm. That doesn't really work nowadays because the chips are too tiny, optical microscopes don't cut it anymore, and crawling around on the floor doesn't cut it anymore either. You're not going to verify 18 billion transistors by hand, no matter how many people you're throwing at the problem. So nowadays, what we do is we use scanning electron microscopes, like that one. We're going to put the little chip inside, and then we use a lot of clever computer vision to find out what's going on that chip and verify if the thing that's going on the physical chip is the thing that's supposed to be going on it, depending on what we ordered. The threat model in this project is slightly different from what I had in the opening example. Instead of manipulating individual transistors, let's just assume for now that what the attacker can do is it can change out Boolean gates in the circuit at arbitrary positions. But they can't mess with individual transistors. They can't do weird stuff with NMP doping. Let's not go there. So remember what I said on the early slide where we had the map. There's companies that are fabless. They're making the designs. They're not producing them. And they send the design over to our fab or foundry, which then actually produces that design and ships back the physical hardware. We assume that the malicious fab takes the design, puts something weird inside that breaks something in a way that's useful for them or to whoever bribed them. And then we are now tasked with finding such manipulations, or better, proving that none is in there. The way we do this is we have a third-party detection lab that gets commissioned for that analysis. And what they do is they compare the original design files versus what has been physically on the hardware using some kind of electron microscope. We have actually done this in the lab. So we had a bunch of chips, we made them, and then we analyzed them. The way we ran this is to minimize any bias and to actually show if this can really be done. We did it with a red team and a blue team. So the red team manipulated the design, and then the blue team went looking for it. And we were facing this tiny issue that these chips were already made because we had them from a previous project, and obviously there wasn't a Trojan on them. So what do? Well, instead of modifying the chip, you modify the design file in the inverse way. So if we are arguing, well, the factory can insert some logic gates, well, let's remove some logic gates from the design and then do the comparison. It's going to look the same. So that's what we did. Then we hand all of this stuff over to the blue team, which is forbidden to talk to those guys on the other side of the floor for a couple of weeks. And the blue team will go look and find the exact places where the red team put the modifications. And then in the end, you sit down and you compare and you see how many you actually found. So these are the 4 chips that we did this on. So this is a 19 nanometer production or process node, and we did it down to 28. Those are not the most modern chips, but this is what's currently easily available to academia. And like this one took a lot of convincing. These things are tiny. They're about up to 2 by 2 millimeters in size. And they have a couple 100,000 logic gates on them. So then what we did is to emulate this Trojan. Here's the threat model. So we have the original chip, and the risk is someone puts a couple logic gates in there that are not supposed to be there, or someone replaces a logic gate. Let's say replace an AND gate with an OR gate. That's also an interesting way to mess things up. So the way we did this on this chip is we changed the design files. So we converted the OR gate into an AND gate, and where we added a gate, kind of just took one out. We're not really concerned with the circuit looking like the circuit's still functioning. We were just concerned about, can we find the fact that there's this place where there's something where there's supposed to be nothing. We're only looking at that layer. We're not actually looking at the connections between the Boolean logic gates. So in total, we replaced in each chip 4 logic gates, and we put 6 new ones in. So that's like 0.001% of the total cells on all of the chips, which were about like 3.5 million across all of them. So this is searching the needle in a haystack. So the blue team then receives a couple samples from all of those chips and receives the original design files, and then they go and compare. And that process starts with sample preparation. So we're taking this chip, we're going to go and mill it out of its package. So it comes in this tiny plastic package with the legs on it. We're taking this out so we can get to the actual silicon. Then we use a lot of very caustic chemicals to get to the actual Boolean logic gates. We stuff it in the scanning electron microscope, and out comes this thing. So those are the original designs, because you can zoom into those like a couple thousand times. And then this is what this actually looks when it comes out of the microscope. So we have about 300 gigabytes of raw image data with about a resolution of between 4.8 nanometers per pixel on the tiny size, and on the large size where you don't need that accuracy, up to about 12 nanometers per pixel. That is still incredibly tiny. So when we zoom into those things and look at like a 0.0001% of those images, this is what it looks like. So those are the 4 different chips, all image on the same microscope. They all look entirely different. But what you can see, all of them have kind of distinct patterns. And those are actually, like these ones are actually the individual Boolean logic gates on that chip. That's what makes the hardware tick. So now what we do is we take all of those microscope images and very carefully, with a lot of student assistant help over many, many weeks, we align them on the original design files. So we can compare this cell by cell. And then what we do, to find additional cells, we do this kind of bias detection. So there's this tiny little dots on it. This is the connections that go vertically between the different layers of the chip. There's one layer that has the transistors, and then above that is all the connections between them. And to make that connection, you use such a via. And they have the really nice advantage that on scanning electron microscopes, they show up really bright in their circles. And that makes them really nice and easy to find with thresholding and a tiny bit of computer vision. And for replaced cells, what we do is simply template matching. So here we can't use the trick of, oh, there's something there where there's supposed to be nothing and just black. What we do here is instead we take this image and we compare whether all of the cells that are supposed to be AND gates are AND gates, or whether there's something that looks different but is still labeled an AND gate. So then probably something has changed. Okay, let's skip over that. So what you're supposed to take away from this is essentially this is what we do. So we take two cells where the design says they should be the same cell, and we check if they really are. The approach isn't perfect. This can sometimes stumble if we give it two cells that look very, very similar. We currently do a bunch of research on getting this dialed in so we can actually identify this no matter how similar those cells look. Yeah, these are the actual Trojans that the blue team has found. So here's all the different replacements. So the design said they should be the same cells, but obviously those images are all looking different. And you can also see that on big feature size that was roughly doable. Here, down on the 28, this gets harder. That's a concerning trend because the smaller you go, kind of the more noise you get, the harder it is to work with those chips. And that makes these Trojans really, really hard to find in the small modern chips. And we need to do something about that. Looking at some results here, those are the 4 chips. On everything but the 28, we were able to find everything.
Does it take the same amount of effort to put Trojans at 28 millimeters, 28 nanometers than 90 nanometers for the red team?
Question was whether for the red team it takes more effort to put a Trojan into the 28 than the 90. That's an excellent question. For what we were looking at, since we were just like changing out cells in the design files, it didn't really matter much. So it can be done in both of them. This one is smaller, but it doesn't necessarily have less cells. So this has about 1.5 million cells versus the 90 that has only 450,000. Makes the design a bit harder to work with, but overall, no, it's roughly the same to insert it. If we want to talk about making something that is actually functional, so making something that's not just replacing a weird cell and the chip breaks, but that actually does something nefarious, you might have more challenges on the smaller sizes. Yes, but it can still be done. Yeah, so on the 28, we had problems finding 3 of the replaced cells. We're still looking for them. Yeah, but overall, that means that this kind of stuff can be done. And it takes roughly 2 days to run the whole stuff. And it takes a couple extra days to prepare that sample. So this is not something you would be doing when you verify every single part that goes into a consumer device, or where you would like rip out the CPU out of your server you just bought and do that because you're destroying it in the process. But this is something that can totally be done when you, as an OEM that builds the hardware, gets a new batch of things, and you take a couple out and you check that to make sure that what you got is actually what you tried to order. Takeaways. So hardware compromise used to be kind of this weird theoretical thing. It is now a practical research field where we have real tooling, where we have test designs, test chips, detection workflows, even though they're not entirely perfect. And we have collaborations between academia and industry. And I think there's a lot of potential, a lot of stuff that can be done to make sure that that supply chain gets secured. Hardware security, I would like to say, is roughly where software security was 15 to 20 years ago. It was once super obscure. It was really hard to get into. As a researcher, you were kind of told, yeah, we're not going to share anything with you. You can't work in that space, or we want you to work on that space, but we're not going to give you any data to work on. Amazing. That's changing. So we're building the infrastructure. We're training students on this. We're starting to also develop open and more verifiable hardware, which is a nice way to do that. And I think industry has begun to care and understand this kind of problem. Lastly, detection is hard. So this project that I just showed, we pulled this off over a couple months. It's not something you do in your backyard, but it's something that can be done when it's done rigorously. Verifying this stuff from software is hard, so we kind of need those physical hardware inspection methods. But we also see that that kind of defense's capability is increasing every year, looking at the publications that are coming out, and the stuff is no longer magic. So if you work on the software side, what do you do with all of that information about transistors? So I have three main takeaways from this talk. People have been talking a lot about secure boot, about securing the platform. That's all super important stuff, and we need to continue those efforts. But we also need to continue them down to the silicon level. I know in some cases there's limited options. I'm not saying throw all of your CPUs out, build your own. That's crazy. But make it part of your threat modeling, particularly when you work on something that is critical, if you work on critical infrastructure, and talk about what is in scope and what is not. Don't blindly make assumptions. Don't blindly trust your hardware. You can't fully verify it. That taking apart the hardware thing probably isn't suitable for everyone. But design for vulnerabilities and avoid single points of failure. Your operating system has multiple randomness sources. Yes, that RD-RAND on the CPU is wicked fast, and it's an amazing source when it works. But don't turn everything else off, because the operating system totally lets you do that. Don't turn everything else off. Have a fallback mechanism in place so if you ever run onto some kind of weird hardware that doesn't do that properly, then you have a safety net. If you don't believe or if you don't share my opinion on hardware Trojans, at least do it because vendors mess up and this kind of stuff happens and they're doing it again and again and again, right? Lastly, in the procurement side, on the governance side, demand transparency from your vendors. Prefer open and verifiable root of trusts on your hardware. There's amazing projects out there like the Google Open Titan that gives you a hardware platform that you can verify. And if you're working on critical infrastructure, ask vendors the same questions you ask your software suppliers. Who designed it? Who built it? How can we be sure that this is correct? Let them give you provenance assurances so that when you design your threat models, you can gauge those risks accurately. If you want to learn more about this whole stuff, I am one of the organizers of a hardware reverse engineering workshop that's called Harris. We also deal with a bunch of hardware Trojan stuff. It's going to be in Germany, so it's a nice opportunity to go visit. It's going to be on March 24th and 25th next year. Submissions and registration open in a couple days, and I would be super happy to see some of you there. Thanks for your attention. That's all. If you want to connect, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to take questions.
So how many years are we away from a independently certifiable supply chain that we can trust?
How many years are we away from an independently verifiable supply chain? Ooh, that is an awesome question. I think if I had the answer, I'd probably not be standing here. It's tough. It is getting tougher with the geopolitical situation we're currently facing. There's amazing work that's being done in this space. There is supply chain laws in the EU that don't necessarily deal with that kind of thing specifically, but it has the right spirit for that. If we want to get there, I think we'll have to work to convince entities that don't want that to happen to change. Because there is a lot of gray market for these kinds of chips. There's a lot of lucrative things that can be done with that other threat model, right? With the what was it? So with the whole intellectual property infringement stuff, people are selling chips on the site and that kind of thing. They don't really want you to have that kind of transparent supply chain. So we need the consumer to demand it, and then we kind of need to convince people all along the way, and that will need both an economic incentive and it will need some governance. When that's going to happen? Not in the next 5 or 10 years. But let's keep trying. Yes.
So what's your thoughts on the fact that most compute is happening in a very centralized manner, the hyperscalers? Do they care as much about this as folks like you? And are they taking steps when they're procuring their hardware to detect these kinds of things? Because that's where a large chunk of our software is running now, and folks don't even see that hardware, right?
Yes. So just for the online audience, the question was, there's so much of our compute that's not running on end user devices anymore. It's running in the cloud. But the cloud is still just someone else's computer, right? So do the hyperscalers that run these kind of systems, do they care about this stuff as much as the random Max Planck hardware security researcher does? Excellent question. I would say they start to. So there was, don't quote me on this, but there was a job posting recently, I think it was AWS. They were looking for a hardware security engineer. That position, I believe, has now been filled. So that is stuff that people are interested in. There is a lot of stuff that's being done on the certification side. So where it's not necessarily the hyperscalers or the kind of consumers, large scale, but still consumers of that hardware that do it. But there's people that are looking into verifying those supply chains on a state level. That's something that people are looking into. We recently had an interaction with a hyperscaler that I'm not going to name because otherwise I think I'm going to lose my job, where we broke some of their cloud infrastructure on the hardware side, not because they had a hardware Trojan, but because they had a vulnerability. It took some time to get them to understand what the issue was. So that's not something they're dealing with every single day, but they took us very seriously. It's patched. And yeah, so they care. They do. And it starts to pick up. And if you want to do that, go work in that space. We need a bunch more people urgently. You go first.
What's the detection rate for the blue team side and basically false positives and false negatives when identifying these vulnerabilities for each size of the chips, like for 90 nanometers and 28 nanometers? How different is it?
Excellent question. The question was, what is our false positive, false negative rate for detecting those things? So looking at these chips, well, you kind of see a trend, right? So for the additional cells, so like putting a cell where there's supposed to be no logic gate, that's kind of obvious. So we find these things very easily. So we had no false negatives, so no Trojans that slipped through. This is good. We had a bunch of false positives, but there were like 17. So that is, considering this is 1.5 million cells, this is easily verifiable by a human in a couple minutes. The situation gets a bit harder when we talk about replacements, because that's a lot less visual information to work with, right? So there's supposed to be a gate, it just looks ever so slightly different. We interestingly get a lot of false positives on this one. I would need to look into the data for exactly why that happened. Again, this is not my personal project. And then we have a detection failure on this one. So here we essentially have kind of a 50% false negative rate. That's a problem. We are currently working on a project to address this. I can tell you as much as we are doing way, 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 way better than these guys. Because they essentially went in, we sat down together and we looked at, hey, here's this nice case study, what can we take away from it and how can we make it provable? So how can we build a robust, actually mathematically sensible way to do this? And our false positives are lower and our false negatives are very, very, very low. Not zero. There is some really evil things you can do as an attacker to make this super hard. So if you do this carefully, then stuff might get interesting. This is currently under submission, so I can't tell you too much more about it, but stuff can be done, and this is already pretty good. There was, I think you still had a question from before?
Yeah, what's your opinion on the Intel management engine?
What is my opinion on the Intel management engine? Excellent question that kind of goes not out of the scope of what I'm doing, but it's kind of adjacent to it. So the Intel management engine is this interesting kind of operating on its own kind of thing that runs on the CPU and that provides all sorts of system features in the background. I would argue that this is mostly on that kind of microarchitectural level. This runs some kind of firmware that's loaded into it. People have done awesome research on understanding what the Intel management engine actually does, reverse engineering its firmware, running custom firmware on it, or just breaking the entire thing if you don't want it. There's really, really cool talks at Chaos Communication Congress, like Germany's biggest hacker convention. They're having another session in December this year. There's a bunch of really nice talks. They're all online. You can go look that up. It's really nice. My main takeaway from IME would be I personally don't like having a thing that runs independently on my hardware that I have no visibility into and no control over. I understand why it's there and why in an enterprise setting it can make sense. I'm not going to say, oh, it's dangerous, you shouldn't be having that. I think if Intel really wanted to screw us over, they had a myriad of other ways to do that. So if the designer wants to mess with your CPU, well, whose design are you checking it against? So at that point, well, you kind of have to put some trust in somewhere. But yeah, I would really, really find it cool if they were to open source that IME firmware, open source the hardware specifications so we can understand what's going on. Because security research has shown over and over and over again that when we built crypto stuff, for example, in a proprietary way, as soon as it's open source, it's broken immediately often because the nice thing about having it open is that so many people can go and verify it independently. So yes, that would be cool. I don't think we're getting it anytime soon. So your question still go on?
Does the logical behavior of Trojans happen in a different way than stuck at 0 or stuck at 1?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Like now we demonstrated that you can hack a chip by making, like a gate stuck at 0, stuck
Yes.
at 1. So is there another form? Because this stuck at 0 and stuck at 1 can be captured in this testing phase if you just improve the test vector. It could be like a test coverage problem to detect these things. I mean, and hence we will not have to look at it with a microscope, especially when we go to the deeps of microtechnology.
Yeah.
So is there another way?
So the question was, if we have this kind of thing where we have a stuck app fault, that should be detectable if we have good testability of the design. So this should probably be able to be found. There are certainly ways to find this kind of stuff if you design your testability right. The fact that hardware bugs that break the whole thing entirely from time to time slip through doesn't make me believe that this will always work and is always foolproof. But yes, if you do this right, you will find this thing. There are other ways. I mean, the threat model from the second project, right, is not a stuck at. So the threat model of that other project where we do, what was that? So where we do the gate replacements, right? So this thing, right? So where we replace some gates with some other gates, that will not be a constant output. Yes, here again, if you design your testability right, you can probably find this. But then again, there's also at some point a trade-off of how much you can actually test, right? So you'll not be able to test every single gate all the time.
Yeah, but testing with like conventional methods, I mean, like better or bigger test vectors is easier than looking at a 7 nanometer, 16 billion chip.
Yes, if you can find this with test vectors, then yes. The concern with that kind of thing is if we want to build a really nasty Trojan, the way you'd probably do that is you build it in some part of the cryptographic area, and you'll make it to trigger only on one very specific input. So that makes it a point function, and point functions are nasty to test if you don't know what you're looking for, because you can't test the entire range. If you know that there's supposed to be a point function on that chip, well, you test for the point function. how do you build a test vector for something you don't know that it's going to be there? The good old attacker-defender problem. As the attacker, I need to find one way in. As the defender, I need to defend against all of them. Building that test vector is not easy. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that can be done by building your tests very carefully, yes.
So you mentioned the Bloomberg, I believe, Supermicro case.
Yes.
Is there, and that one has been denied.
Multiple times.
Yeah. So whether it's true or not, fuzzy. Is there any other examples? And probably no, because I believe you probably would have used it. But are there like more smoking gun examples, like where it's kind of definitive? Yes, this was hacked. Other than this kind of like, some people say it's true, some people deny it. Hard to say.
The question was, is there anything except the Bloomberg story about the big hack? Maybe.
Not necessarily about the big hack, but instances of Trojans being introduced or,
right,
or
like
malicious hardware.
Other kinds similar to that. My answer is maybe. So somewhat. So there is someone quoting someone else who they're not wanting to name, that apparently a defense contractor has contracted another chip maker in Europe somewhere, we don't know where, that has put some kind of kill switch in that could apparently be activated remotely, and that's all we know. There is another that looked into FPGAs, so field programmable gate arrays, reprogrammable chips, if you will, and said, well, that we found a backdoor in the chip. The point is, well, that one is kind of an unreliable source. So someone said, someone told us that they heard about someone else saying that this company did a thing. What do we know what their incentives are? Like, maybe we can't really independently verify that, right? Because, I mean, if you can get your hands on one of those chips, send them my way, and I will happily write a paper about this. But they're not gonna let us do that, right? So that's the problem. And this other thing, it turns out that yes, there is the command sequence on that FPGA that lets you do stuff. There is a totally legitimate reason for that stuff being able to be done. The fact that this is still enabled in production, they are saying this was a bug on the microarchitecture and it should have been disabled, but wasn't. So did they just see that because they got caught? Did they say it because that's what happened? We don't know. So maybe, but there's more than this one example where people claim that they have found something.
I'm not trying to be a trick question, but
But it's a trick question.
yeah, it is a trick question. Fantastic work. A lot of this is predicated on two things, where you might have in the field a friendly or cooperative supply chain, right, where they're willing to be beaten into submission and give you designs and cooperate. And the second is based off of comparative logic, right? You have a known good version of that architecture or that design. Is there presently work underway of some sort of threat model of kind of going by the unknown type of problem, where you don't have that cooperation or you don't have something to compare against?
Okay, let's unpack that. So the question, if I understood you right, was that I'm making a couple assumptions here. Yes. Good.
So let's say you have either an uncooperative or potentially malice supply chain somewhere,
Okay.
or suspicion thereof.
So I have a malicious or uncooperative supply chain.
Thus,
Okay.
do you know if you have a positive control to compare against in this sort of research?
Yes. So I'm making the assumption here that I can get my hands on the design file, so I have something to verify against. This is what we usually call a golden model. there is research, both existing research and ongoing research on what we do if we don't have that. Two projects I would like to highlight. I don't have a backup slide for that one, unfortunately. So what can be done is there's the whole field of hardware reverse engineering. So if you want to sink an incredible amount of money into this, what you can do, it's easier for smaller designs, like say a small cryptographic accelerator that sits on its own silicon. It's more tiny. It makes it a lot easier than verifying that whole Intel CPU. You take it apart, layer by layer, get all of the wires, get all of the transistors, and you recover the design yourself. We have done this for FPGAs where it's a lot easier. We have also done it once on a microcontroller, like an STM something. It is painful. It requires a lot of work. There's a lot of cool stuff that can be done if you don't need perfect accuracy, but for this thing, unfortunately, you do need perfect accuracy. And that makes it extremely expensive, but it can be done. If you're looking, the thing that prevents your nuclear power plant from blowing up, you might want to be willing to invest that kind of money into it. The other thing that is being done is you can, when we're talking counterfeits, for example. So some other company rips you off, rips another company off, makes their own design of kind of the same chip, sells it as the same part, makes a bunch of money out in the back market. There is something we call iris. So in situ infrared inspection. What they do is they use the fact that silicon is usually transparent to infrared light. So you can, with chips that are not in a package, you can shine a light into it, and just with a fancy microscope, at least you can see kind of all the different areas on the chip. That helps you detect a okay chip versus a fake that's a different architecture but behaves the same, which is often how these microcontrollers are being ripped off. We don't kind of need a golden model of the design. You just need to get your hands, well, not only on bad ones. And then you look for, do they look the same? And this can be done rapid fire. This is non-destructive. So this is actually something you could do against every single thing in the batch that you buy, as long as they're not all bad. That gives you a way to find these kinds of things. This is not going to help you against that 1% manipulation in a random number generator somewhere. There's research that tries to do this with side channel analysis. So looking at power draw, and then they're making the assumption that the change is big enough that the power profile of the chip will change. So again, get your hands not only on bad ones, the bad ones will have a tiny bit different power consumption than the good ones, and that might also reveal something. Then you still don't know what it does. You just know that there's something weird here. And then again, you turn to hardware reverse engineering, take it apart, and find out, okay, what exactly is it that makes this one different than that one? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a little, do you know of a set of software toolchain that a software vendor can use to create, to detect the problems? Or is that, like you mentioned, it's more of the hardware side?
Do we have a software toolchain that software folks are supposed to use for detecting bad CPUs? Or what's the scope? What are we looking for?
Yeah.
Not to the best of my knowledge. So the hardware bugs, this thing, yeah. So this you can go look for. Looking for this is easy, where you just need to reboot your machine afterwards. Then the kinds of hardware bugs that mess with your RD rand, those can be found. Essentially, what you would do for those things is you would call the random number generator, and if it returns all zeros or it returns FFFF, then you know that you probably have that weird AMD bug or the weird Intel bug. If you have something malicious in there that's going to give you 2 to the 32 randomness and then repeats, whew, not easy. I am not aware of like a one-size-fits-all library you can bundle with your software to look for these things. Again, you'd need to go look for all of them. I need to find one of them you don't know about. Trust your supply chain. Don't have to use those tools. Verify them when you buy hardware. Don't ship it with the software to the end user. I would like to give you a better answer. I think I don't have one.
Not a question. Maybe to shed the light on what you were asking. Had an unfortunate situation. I was working on a project, an external DAPT for a certain financial institution somewhere in Africa, and they have had the bad luck to purchase a printer that had another module on its motherboard that was communicating to someone. So it is not crazy as this, as modifying the Intel Pentium or Lite. But
It is the way more realistic model.
Yeah, so it's that crazy to an extent that it had C2C that was communicated.
Yeah.
So it was not copying only or sending the copies of whatever they are trying to print, but it was its own computer. Scan through, act as a computer in the field. So yeah, it went overboard. They took some legal action and likes, but the damage had been done. Yeah.
That is
Precautions and video SLAs. Yeah.
That is a wild incident. So if I don't think I can do this justice, but if I can recap this for the online folks. So we have someone in the audience who found a hardware Trojan kind of on the printed circuit board level, where they had a printer at some kind of financial institution that had a additional module in it that was talking home to some kind of command and control server to exfiltrate documents as they were getting printed, I assume. That is the more realistic model that kind of goes, that's somewhat a Bloomberg ST Micro Lite, right? So that's like, yeah, you don't have a manipulation in your chip, which is what we mostly do research on, but is you have a manipulation on your circuit board, or you have an additional module in your circuit board. Yes, that is scary. Again, these things you're also not going to find in software. You might be able to find them with that kind of power profiling thing, because these things need power to run. That can be done if they talk home. They will have kind of electromagnetic interference that you can look for. That is something that is being done. Some people are testing credit card terminals by spinning them around real fast.
It's like the magic 8-ball.
Yeah. So the idea, thinking about it, the idea is actually not that bad, right? So if there is actually a physical thing in there, the center of gravity will shift a tiny bit, and it will have a tiny bit more inertia because there's some extra mass in this thing. So if you spin it real fast, the unmodified thing will spin a bit differently than the other thing. And if you have a sensitive enough detector, you can find that. So that is something that people have looked into. Now that you bring this thing up, we do have an example of a hardware Trojan. The pager thing, if that rings anyone's bell.
Sure.
We have the pagers that blow up on command. I would like to call this a hardware Trojan. So that was a manipulation in that device that the end user didn't want to have in there. It was remotely command and controllable. It triggered on a very specific signal that was really hard to find before that. And by just opening the thing up and looking inside it, no one realized that this dangerous thing was in there. And then a lot of people were harmed and killed because of that incident. I don't want to go into politics here, but this happened. So this thing we have evidence for. Everything that happens on that microchip level, people are pointing fingers at each other, but we don't kind of know. But this one we do. Oh.
Do you care to speculate at all about reasons why we don't know more about this kind of stuff? like it seems like this is all state level threat difficulty, and still an area where maybe there is an edge in this space where there are not a lot of edges left. Is this maybe still, is this an interesting frontier where there's still some opportunity for nations to escalate?
Do I want to speculate on why we don't see these things more often? I would hope that we don't see that low-level silicon thing more often because it's not being done that often. It goes in that sense of no one's going to burn a 0 day on you unless you are a very, very big enemy or they have like a gigantic amount of financial or personal gain. If a foundry did this thing and got caught doing it, they could shut down. Like, who's doing business with a company that was like caught and proven to build malicious things into your hardware? That is a really bad business model. What I do know is that state-level actors do that kind of stuff by changing out chips. So it's documented that I believe the NSA or CIA have done this with routers. So they would intercept them, and they would intercept the actual packages in shipping. They would open them up and unsolder some of the controllers on the board, put their own ones in. If you just get the thing, it looks totally benign, and they have all the right labels and stuff. If you were to take them apart and even just use the iris thing, you would see that's a different chip. You don't need to fully reverse engineer it. You don't need to really think about, oh, someone modified a single transistor somewhere. It would just be a different design, same label stamped on it. If you just verified that floor plan, you'll probably find that. But this is something that has been done, but it's mostly state-level actors. I guess the bigger threat would be counterfeit chips. Because, like, well, who knows if the counterfeit thing is actually secure or if it just behaves the same if you don't try to hack it. And finding counterfeits and finding out who made them and getting them off the supply chain might be a lucrative endeavor. I think that's pretty much all I can speculate about. If you ever find one in the wild, please bring me up. I'm happy to write a paper with you about it, and that will make us famous. All right.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was maybe the longest Q&A that we've had this year. So no, and I think it's because we had such another wonderful talk. One more time, thank you so much, Renee, for coming over. So that concludes 2025 for the OWASP Ottawa chapter monthly meetups. Again, thank you so much if you've been joining us online, if you've been joining us here, whether it was on the main floor or up here in the 5th floor tower. We've really appreciated sharing some knowledge and sharing community here with you guys, with you folks for the last year, and we look forward to doing it again next year. Again, you'll find us online, owasp.org/Ottawa. Find us in the Slack channel. That's also where you'll find survey details posted in the next little bit. You'll find them on our socials as well, which again, you can all find at owasp.org/Ottawa. Safe home. We'll see you in January. Take care.